Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in to this video. I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to talk about what we can learn about life from Mr. Eddie Van Halen. Once again, I appreciate you clicking on this link. Let me just briefly introduce myself. My name is Dave McIntyre. I'm a professor. I teach emergency management, homeland security, and national security, pretty much all of the bad stuff in the news. But I'm glad to be with you today for this video. My apology, I wish we could be in person. I just got a new outfit and unfortunately I can't show it to you. Okay, I confess, I don't own any spandex and I don't have a ripped t-shirt, and that's probably a good thing at my age. But I have a few things that hopefully you'll laugh at and some music as well along the way. Let's get started. So in this presentation, we'll learn about Eddie Van Halen and we'll consider what he and his music can teach us about life. Let me begin with the context of this presentation. I was a pretty rambunctious young man. I survived my childhood and my friends did too. And what I mean by that is I had one of these big wheels and I would go barreling down 18th Avenue. I'm surprised I didn't hit a car or get hit by a car. And unlike this little boy on the right, I actually had my friends line up under the ramp. So that tells you what kind of kid I was when I was growing up. Well, as I got older, my interest turned to sports, and I really loved football. I had some heroes, and I wanted to be just like them, and so I thought that I would become a professional football player. Unfortunately, my life took a turn that I didn't expect. This is me on the left skiing. I actually crashed skiing, busted up my knee, and had surgery. So that was really disappointing. I was able to play football my freshman and sophomore years of high school. Unfortunately, I got hit in a practice and I blew out my ACL, my MCL, and my meniscus, and that was the end of my football career. So I began to turn my attention to other things, and one of the things that I really appreciated of the 1980s was the music. We had big bands with big hair and big music, and it was kind of a fun era. I purchased some gear and tried to learn some of the music of that particular era. Here's some examples if you'll bear with me. It was a lot of fun to have a hobby like this. I had some friends and we decided to start a band, and here's an example of some of the things that we played. Anyway, we were never really any good, and we played in our basement, but the good thing is my parents loved our music. In fact, they would come to me and they said, "Hey Dave, we really enjoy your music, it's great, but we feel kind of selfish only having you here in our house. Why don't you go to Sean's or Kevin's and play there too?" But we did have a few performances, and as you can tell by this picture, I definitely grew up in the 80s. That is the definition of shorts right there. Nevertheless, our rock career didn't work out as a band. You have an expectation of what your life will be, and unfortunately, there's a reality, and it's not being popular, it's just having a bunch of guitars. And to make matters worse, I didn't even have a cat. So I decided I better just grow up, and I decided to get married. I sold all of my gear and purchased a ring for my wife. Of course, I would have to provide for her and my kids who would come, and so I had to figure out what I would do. If I couldn't play sports, and if I couldn't be a rock star, I guess I would have to settle for being a professor. And that's what I did. I advanced my education. I've had a great life with my wife and my kids, but something was missing, and I noticed that during COVID, and so I started to look at guitars again. And this was me looking at guitars, and this was my wife's response. But she was a trooper, and she allowed me to buy some gear. I purchased a guitar and an amp, this time some better quality equipment, and it's been fun to relearn guitar. And that brings me back to the greatest rock and roll guitarist of all time, Eddie Van Halen. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Eddie was the son of Jan and Eugenia Van Halen. They were from the Netherlands, and because they were an interracial couple, they were discriminated against, and they decided to leave the Netherlands and come to the United States, and they came as part of the Refugee Relief Act. The Van Halen family immigrated to the United States. They settled in Southern California in Pasadena, and it was kind of a rags to riches story. His family was very poor, and yet Eddie had a lot of success. And here's a quote from David Lee Roth on Eddie's success. With that in mind, I'm just going to play the national anthem for you. Bear with me. This is about 2 minutes. So Eddie was raised in a family that appreciated music. His father was a jazz musician, and starting at age 6, Eddie took classical piano lessons. Eddie followed in the footsteps of his father, but unlike his dad, he wanted to learn rock music. He initially purchased a drum set, and as the story goes, when he was out delivering newspapers to pay for his drum set, his brother was playing, and Eddie realized that his brother was really good on the drums. So he shifted to electric guitar. He admired Eric Clapton, and he ended up teaching himself guitar, which is really interesting because he didn't have someone tell him this is the right way and the wrong way to play guitar. Eddie learned by himself, and I think that made him very innovative in his techniques. One of the things that was interesting about Eddie and his brother, is that they were very dedicated. They started a band named the Broken Combs. They played in their elementary school. He loved this experience and therefore wanted to be a professional musician, and as a result, always had a guitar in his hand. He was continually practicing that instrument. I think one of the things that we can learn from him is that if we're dedicated, if we practice, if we work hard, our dedication will pay off. Another interesting thing about Eddie is that he was willing to take risks, and therefore he introduced and refined many guitar techniques. Let me share a few of those with you. Anyway, you get a sense of how unique he was playing the guitar. Besides introducing several new techniques, Eddie had some great music with his band. Let me share a little bit of that with you today. Well, as you can see, there's some great music. In addition to working hard and being dedicated, Eddie Van Halen was very detail-oriented. He had a lot of serious recording sessions with a lot of editing. He had rehearsal schedules that were rigorous. He had a lot of sound checks before each concert. Everything was done to be ready for performances. There's also an interesting story about M&Ms and contracts. When Van Halen would sign contracts with the venues where they would perform, there was a checklist of over 100 items that had to be accomplished. And in order to make sure that they would accomplish those things, they could go through each item individually, or they could look at just one item. And one of those items was in the break room. It was expected that the venue would provide M&Ms, and they would have to take the brown M&Ms out and separate them. And in this way, Van Halen knew that they had read the entire contract and met the expectations of their concert. In addition to working smarter and not just harder, Eddie was very creative. He was disappointed from his pickups of the day of that particular era. There was a lot of feedback, and he wanted to eliminate the undesired noise. And so he dipped his pickups in wax, and this would eliminate some of that noise. And this process is actually used by many guitar manufacturers today. Eddie was creative in other ways. One of the things he realized as he was playing guitar is that no guitar had all of the features that he wanted. And so he actually combined several parts from different guitars into what's known as this Frankenstrat, and this allowed him to get the versatility and tone he preferred. Let me walk you through that quickly. The first electric guitar invented was the Telecaster. As you can see here, the neck was small and thin. It was easy to maneuver on the neck. It provided a fairly decent sound in some ways, but it was a very heavy guitar, uncomfortable. It didn't have a tremolo bar, and it lacked tuning stability, and perhaps it had a little bit too much country twang. Eddie tried the Les Paul and really liked the Les Paul in terms of the pickup. It has a real full, beefy, gritty sound, and he liked that. Unfortunately, the neck is a little bit wide. It's a little bit deep. It's relatively slow. It's an uncomfortable guitar in some ways, and again, it lacks some tuning stability, and it didn't have a tremolo bar. Eddie therefore tried the Stratocaster, and he really liked this. The neck was fast, it was a light guitar, it was comfortable, it had a tremolo bar, but again, the sound was a little bit thin, and the pickup configuration was a little bit bothersome in terms of his aggressive picking style, and it lacked tuning stability. As I mentioned, Eddie invented a new type of guitar. This was exhibited in his Frankenstrat, and it had all of the features that he wanted. It was light and fast, it was comfortable, had a really deep sound, and it had tuning stability, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Thus, Eddie invented a new type of guitar, a super strat or a shredder, and you see some examples of those here. Eddie was creative in other ways. He was always chasing tone. Unlike some of the guitarists before him who would plug their guitar into the amp and that's how they would roll, Eddie had a lot of effects pedals and he used those. So he introduced the brown sound of the 80s, and his tone in the 90s was very interesting because he had a unique mix of speakers. One set of speakers would have certain effects on it and a certain timing of delay. Then he would have some speakers that were dry with no effects, and then the last set of speakers would also have other effects, chorus if you will, and a longer delay, and it gave him a really interesting tone in that era. Eddie was creative in other ways. He played piano and synthesizer beyond electric guitar, and I'll provide some examples of that. In one case, he's running a synthesizer through a guitar pedal into an amp. In another case, he's playing some jazz music with his dad. There's another situation where he has a drill, an electric cordless drill that he's using on his guitar, and then some other examples as you see. So let me run through these quickly.
Bombadita, 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 bombadita.
So as you can see, there was some really amazing music based on his creativity. Turning our attention to other topics, Eddie Van Halen sought help from others when needed. Let me provide you some examples of that. When he would first perform, it was in smaller venues, and he had this 100-watt amp, a Marshall that would just blast the audience, and it was too loud. So he initially turned the amp around so it was facing backward to try to dampen some of the sound, but that didn't really work. So he explained this problem to a clerk at Dial Radio. This is like a Radio Shack store, and the man recommended that he use a Variac. With this device, Eddie could crank up all of the knobs on his amp, but then turn down the power, which would lower the volume. So his guitar would scream, but at a lower volume level. Eddie would also seek the help of others in terms of his guitar. Eddie's playing was very dynamic, and it caused his guitar to go out of tune. He explained this problem to a colleague, a man named Floyd Rose, and basically together they invented what's known as the Floyd Rose locking tremolo system, and this helped him get more tuning stability. Eddie was also known for playing out of tune at times. In some cases, he would drop the G or B string down slightly for running with the devil. In other cases, he would actually drop all of the strings down to an E flat. But on other occasions, he would take the E string and drop it to a D. And this was time consuming and labor intensive. And so he worked with engineers to create a drop D tuning device. And this is common on many rock guitars. And one of his famous songs is Unchained, where he plays it in a drop D format. Let me share that with you briefly. Eddie was also known for his ability to improvise. He did that individually when he was performing a solo, but he also did it as a band. Let me share one example with you. In March of 2015, Van Halen was performing live on Jimmy Kimmel, and singer David Lee Roth was kind of a crazy front man, and he always had a baton and was twirling that around. In this particular case, he smacked himself in the nose and cut his nose, had to get medical attention. So this is a live performance, mind you. So David Lee Roth went off to get some assistance, some medical care. In the meantime, Eddie and his brother had to kill time, so they had to improvise. And he was able to do that because he understood music so well. Another interesting characteristic of Van Halen is that he was able to build bridges, if you will. He was picked on when he was a kid because he didn't speak language. A lot of the black kids in his area were picked on, but he became friends with them, and he actually performed the solo Beat It for Michael Jackson. This story reminds me of a book I read with my granddaughter, The Crayon Box That Talked. I love this poem here. We are like a box of crayons, each one of us unique, but when we're together, the picture is complete. Eddie made some mistakes at times. There was an imbalance in his life, if you will. He was often too focused on guitar. He ended up divorcing his wife. His band broke up twice, and Van Halen 3 just didn't work out the way he wanted it to, so he was a little bit discouraged. Eddie abused drugs and alcohol, and this led to the low point in the band's history. He was able to overcome the addiction, but the lifestyle probably cost him his life in the end. Eddie learned from that experience, and he was commonly saying that if you ever make a mistake when you're performing, you just keep playing. And that's what he did. He moved on from that experience. This brings up another lesson. If you're ever discouraged, just remember that you grew up during the era of Van Halen. On a side note, if you're ever discouraged, you can look at Rick Allen, the drummer for Def Leppard. He was involved in a traffic accident because he was driving drunk. He ended up severing his arm and had to learn to play the drums with his feet mainly and one hand. So there's some lessons there, but that's a lesson for another day. One of the cool things about Eddie is that he was always smiling when he was performing. He loved music, he was happy, and just enjoyed what he was doing with his career. Eddie was also generous with his resources. He ended up providing a big donation to Mr. Holland's Opus, providing funds for schools so that kids could have musical instruments, and so he paid it forward. To wrap things up, let me recap a few points about what we can learn from the life of Eddie Van Halen. First, our plans may not work out, and we might have to shift gears, and that's what Eddie did in terms of moving from the drums to guitar. He was adaptive, he took risks, he was dedicated, he worked smarter, not just harder. He was very creative and innovative. We need to learn from him that we have to avoid imbalance in life and avoid addictions. He always smiled, he was a bridge builder, and he was generous to those in need. To conclude, let me share a final riff with you, if I may. This is Eddie Van Halen's most famous solo. It's called Eruption. I'm definitely a lot slower than he is, but hopefully you'll enjoy it. Well, thanks for enduring that. I hope you learned a few things from Van Halen that might be applicable to your life. Have a great day.